Hey guys, we're here again to talk about one of the biggest hoaxes in American history. The moon landing, right?
I think people have actually been punched by the actual astronauts for making that claim. It's just fortunate that none of them are here. But if anybody's watching, I'd be happy to stand in and just take care of it right now.
I'm just kidding. I don't think the moon landing's a hoax at all. I think it's actually one of the
Not
coolest.
the first one. Like maybe okay, no, none of them. I don't know. Maybe.
I think it's super cool. I mean, the two astronauts who went up in the SpaceX thing, I mean, props to them.
4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition. Liftoff of the Falcon 9 and Crew Dragon. Go NASA. Go SpaceX. Godspeed, Bob and Doug.
America has launched.
After Trump announced, right, Space Force is coming out, the thought is that all of us are now thinking, how viable is this for me for a career, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm totally ready to sign up and go to space. I will make that sacrifice. And actually now with the craziness in the world around us, like props to the two guys who are not here at this moment dealing with the drama and the craziness of Corona and everything else happening. So NASA astronauts, well done. You got out just in time. But how cool that people are now private individuals, not government sponsored anymore, right? Private company, people are still going into space, and they're talking about just a matter of time before there is another moon landing, which again would be absolutely amazing.
So cool, so cool. I mean, you actually remember the first moon landing, right?
Mm-hmm. I remember a lot of the shots in space, because you went through the Mercury program, the Gemini program, and you went through the Apollo, and I remember all of those happening. I was actually live when the space race started back with what they called Sputnik, because Sputnik was in 57 and the Russians got a guy going around the Earth before we did, but John Glenn's going to catch up. And so, yeah, I remember all that. Absolutely.
Okay, so some of the cool things that we have is actually things related to space. And we've shown a couple of these space-related things before. We have some different things today, because one of the things that is very interesting where we are today, where just recently we celebrated people now going into space. And if you go back in time, 1968, you had a Hong Kong flu, which right now we have coronavirus. There was unrest in 1968. There were protests. There were riots. There was a lot of similarities, and they sent men into space. And when these guys went into space, one of the very cool things is related to something right here.
Well, let's actually back up for a minute, because just take the top of that page right there. What is the top of that page called? It has a title on that, and
So
it says...
this is the Apollo Prayer League is what this says.
So the Apollo Prayer League is significant because the Apollo missions, all of the Apollo missions, and it goes back to President Kennedy, because
This is going to be important in just a minute.
you go back to President Kennedy, and President Kennedy back, you were looking in 58, they started kind of NASA, got it going. And in 61, he said, let's make a pledge to put a man on the moon in this decade.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth.
So he's saying we're going to do this in the 60s, and we're sitting at 61 when he makes that announcement at Rice University, and you're going, oh my gosh, can this be done? And so they scramble and start doing it. So Apollo is the program that was going to put a man on the moon, land on the moon and return. That was part of the pledge. So
That's fortunate.
That's right.
We're not just dropping you off and good luck to you.
So Apollo 1, they have it going, and a fire on the pad cost the life of the first astronauts in Apollo 1. So they died as a result of that. And at that point in time, they started the Apollo Prayer League. They said, we need to cover the Apollo space program with prayer. So employees at NASA, others got together a big prayer movement, a big prayer group. And those guys that were going out on Apollo 1 had wanted to take Bibles with them into space. And the goal was to put Bibles on the moon. And so there's a spiritual mindset to this thing from the very beginning, and the employees, the Apollo Prayer League. And so that's what they've got going, is the Apollo Prayer League. Well, you get the first 7 Apollo missions out of the way, and that's circling the Earth and getting more and more laps around the Earth. And finally, we're ready to leave Earth's atmosphere and go to the moon and circle the moon and come back. And that was Apollo 8. And so Apollo 8, as they were circling the moon, they arrived there on Christmas Eve. And Christmas Day, they're going around the moon, and that's what this was.
So this is a signature from Frank Borman down here. And what's at the bottom is significant because you actually can go and you can listen to this online, the announcement from these guys, and it starts over here with I don't know, captain, or I don't remember what his rank was. Kind of silly today when we're talking about the astronauts, we call them by their first names instead of giving them their titles. But so William Anders, he starts off, and you see down here what they actually read. And this announcement can be heard online.
For all the people back on Earth, the crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like to send to you. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, let there be light. And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good, and divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And the evening and the morning were the first day. And God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. And God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. And God called the firmament heaven. And the evening and the morning were the second day. And God said, let the waters under the heaven be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called he seas. And God saw that it was good. And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth.
It starts in Genesis 1, and they just read several verses that's kind of giving perspective as they're looking down on earth, and they're saying, here's, right back to the Bible, here's where it all started. And this is the excerpts they read from Genesis, and this is signed by one of the guys, Frank Borman, who was there reading it. But what is even, to me, more cool is one of the things that was taken to space were a series of Bibles. And there were several different, programs that took these different spaceships that took these Bibles.
Yeah, and actually, even with that, before you get to that, part of what happened was back at Apollo 1, they wanted Bible on the moon. And so with Apollo 11, which is where Neil Armstrong stepped on the moon, they had Bibles, but they forgot to put it in the right spacecraft. So it was in the command module orbiting the moon instead of the lunar landing. So the Bibles made it around the moon. They just didn't make it on the moon. And so they were actually going to be on the moon with Apollo 13, but that's the spacecraft that had the tragedy and kind of blew up on the way, and so they had to bring it back. So they never landed with the Bibles there, which takes us to this. This is part of that first.
So this is one of the Bibles, and saying it's one of the Bibles, right? This is like a little microchip, essentially. This is the first 50 chapters from the book of Genesis.
And it's shrunk down so small that in order to actually read it, you would have to magnify it a ton of times, which is how they were able to get them on the ship, right? Because every single ounce costs however much, like gallons of gas.
And it was 500, they took 512 Bibles to the surface of the moon. And this is part of one of those Bibles.
So this is the book of Genesis. And why, to me, this is very cool is because one of the things that was read by that Apollo mission in 1968 was from the book of Genesis, those first several verses. And one of the comparisons that is even interesting today, and at that time in America where there was so much unrest, so many issues, the flu, everything they were battling that seems so similar to where we are today, one of the things that they kept forefront in Americans' mind, because this was a big deal. Every American is watching. Every American is listening to this program. When they make the announcement, people want to know, what are they going to say? And what they say is bringing people's attention back to the Bible. And it seems like where we are today in culture, it would be really good for people to come back and remember the Bible.
That spiritual emphasis, too, was so strong that so many of the astronauts that went into space, while they were in space, they had a real turnaround in their spiritual life. There were a number of them that just completely, they came back, having got outside the atmosphere of Earth and could see things from a better perspective. Oh my gosh, it turned them to God. And so one of those guys was Jim Irwin, who was on Apollo 15. It's interesting, when Jim came back, the way he signed his photos was his love from the moon. So Jesus' love from the moon, and here he signs autograph. He says, love and Jesus. So he's one of many. Charlie Duke on Apollo 16 was another guy that when he got back, his life was turned around. And it's interesting, as you say, we turned people toward the Bible and God, and these guys really did have real Christ experiences, real God experiences.
I think that's my favorite part about the entire kind of lunar and moon and space story is all these guys that come back, because obviously the technological journey and the difficulties and just the I'm a history guy, I don't like math, but oh my gosh, the amount of science and technology and thinking and just cleverness and human ingenuity that went in to get these guys there. And then once they get there, they have an even more amazing transformation and then come back really just on fire for Jesus. I mean, reading their writings is incredible.
And the fact that part of NASA has a prayer league that is part of praying for all these guys and praying for the engineers and the scientists. I mean, it really, and so where we are today, great comparison.
Yeah. So looking at now, we have some astronauts up in space. It's a great time to pray for them, for their mission, their journey. Obviously going forward, praying for what might come from this space program. Hopefully more people going on the moon, which one day sign us up, right? Like, yes, we want to be a part. So if anybody's watching, if you have connections, we'd love to go, right? Like, we'll sit in the back, we'll be quiet, we'll take a book and read on the way. It'd be awesome. So in the midst of this, remembering that for many early astronauts, their spiritual awakening was strengthened, was affirmed. So much happened to them once they got beyond this atmosphere. And I think for us, sometimes we just need to look beyond our circumstances and realize there's so much more. And this is part of what even early astronauts recognized. One of the things we know about the Founding Fathers is they were people who studied the Bible, very influenced by the Bible. Many of them learned to read using the Bible. So the Bible was very much part of their everyday vocabulary, vernacular, and we see this in their writings. We see it in their speeches. Patrick Henry, actually in his famous Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death speech, makes this allusion to, he says, there's one lamp by which my feet are guided. And saying that there's a lamp that guides our feet, Psalms 119 talks about that there's a lamp unto our feet, a light into our path. But this also is a true thought historically, because lamps used to be what we would use to be able to walk down the path before there was electricity.
Absolutely, and we actually have an ancient lamp. This goes back to Israel. In fact, this actually goes back to the city of David during King David's reign there. So this is an ancient oil lamp, and how it would work is you would have a wick that would lay kind of right here in the lip, and this body would be filled up with some oil. And so then you would light the wick and it would work just like any other oil lamp. But this is an oil lamp from that biblical period of King David that we have.
One of the things we love to collect at Wall Builders is certainly old things, historical things that we can tell a story about. And as much as the Founding Fathers were influenced by the Bible, it's still really cool to have something actually from the time of the Bible.
What I have here are two of the most memorable and important guns used in American history. I'll start with this one. This right here is what's called a short land pattern musket. It is a smooth bore. It's got a barrel of 42 inches. And in fact, if we look at it, it's actually got the crown crest of England. It's got GR, which stands for the Latin Georgius Rex, or King George. This is for the Tower of London. And it was actually made in England. It was the English musket that was used in all of their colonization, and it was also what was primarily used by the colonists in America. And so when the American War for Independence started, this was primarily what you would find over the mantelpiece in their homes. So when Lexington and Concord happened and the church bells started ringing, this is most likely what they would have grabbed to meet and assemble to push off the British oppression and tyranny. If we look, it's got a flintlock right here because that's how it worked. It was a flintlock musket, and it would strike here, ignite the powder, and exactly like how you would see it in The Patriot or one of those movies, it would fire. Now, if we look down the barrel, it's got a big old barrel, and that's the size of the ball that it would have fired. So this is, a marble of about that big that's coming at you, and that's why they all lumped together, because they were so inaccurate that if you were trying to just stand out there and shoot at one guy, you would be there for days on end trying to get just one guy. So they said, you know what, we'll be nice to each other and we'll all line up next to each other to make it really easy. Thankfully, that all changed by the time we got to this. This right here was the main battle rifle for the American forces during the Second World War. It's called an M1 Garand or an M1 Garand, depending on whether or not you're American or Canadian. And that's interesting because it was actually designed by a Canadian immigrant to America whose name was Garand. As you can see, there's actually no magazine because it actually used a clip that was inserted into the rifle itself. General George Patton, one of the most famous American generals during the Second World War, called this M1 rifle, he said, "In my opinion, the M1 rifle is the greatest battle implement ever devised." So as you hear a lot about guns and gun control in the news, I think it's important to remember that these are tools that can be used for both good and bad. And in American history, we can see that they have been used for instruments to bring freedom to America and to secure liberty for America and the world.
Noah Webster is known as the schoolmaster to America. Now, he's the guy who helped define words, actually made words where there was a right and wrong way to spell it. Before Noah Webster, apparently, you could spell it however you thought it sounded and it was okay. I would have done a lot better in school back in those days, but he did his blueback speller. He did many things. Probably the most famous was his dictionary. We actually have an original dictionary from Noah Webster, 2-volume set. He learned, I think, 28 languages to go back to the root of every single word to define it. Well, as he's defining these words, what he realized is there's a lot of Old English words that are very different. And so the spelling would change, and even the way the words were used, sometimes they embrace new definitions because so many things were changing. He decided one of the things we need a Bible in the more common English language. So in 1833, he came out with a Bible, and this Bible, he actually explained up front. We've redefined some words and words that made sense hundreds of years ago that they're not really used in common vernacular, so we've changed it. He put in the front of the Bible all the words that were being changed just so you would know he's walking in integrity and not just arbitrarily changing scripture. Well, we also have several things when he was getting ready for this Bible. This is a pre-release version where he put his notes down here of things that should change. Actually, we have a couple letters where he was writing to different people and talking about how in the Bible they had misspelled or used the old form of the word, and we need the new form of the word. It needs to be more uniform. As we look at all the things that Noah Webster contributed, he actually argued that you couldn't have a good education without the Bible. This is why he wanted to make the Bible available for everybody to understand. As we talk about getting back to education or the way schools are going today, maybe we should look at the Bible as being part of the foundation we get back to, because as Noah Webster pointed out, this is the foundation of all education. Hey guys, at Wall Builders, we have a new product line of t-shirts, actually a few different kinds. So on the one Jonathan's sporting, it's actually a Frocket front pocket. On the back, it has Washington crossing the Delaware. It says the original surprise party because, hey, on Christmas back then, we actually surprised the Hessians. Hey, we're here, and we won. Also, we have a Squad Goals t-shirt, which is names of founding fathers. We also have a couple other Wall Builders t-shirts, and actually on the gray one, on the back, it has the Bible verse upon which Wall Builders is based, so you can find out more about that. If you want to have a Wall Builders t-shirt, if you want to support that, or just have a fun t-shirt, go to wallbuilders.com for more.
The inauguration of George Washington. That inauguration, it set the stage for everything that was to follow with the federal government. So they want that to be very successful. And how do you set the stage and how do you set the tone? And what do you do to start something that's never been done before? Well, what they did was the first activity of the inauguration was that they called the city of New York to come pray together. They rang the bells and they asked people to go into churches and pray leading up to the inauguration. Then when the inauguration began, George Washington and the House and the Senate met together. They're in Federal Hall in New York City. And after they opened Congress and George Washington's there, he walks out on the balcony where all the people are watching. And he's there on the balcony, he takes the oath of office. Now, he took the oath of office required by the Constitution and he added the phrase, "So help me God." And that phrase was required by state law in many of the states, but it wasn't in the Constitution, but Washington put that as part of his oath. Next, he took an oath on the Bible, which was open to Genesis 49. And then after he took the oath on the Bible, according to this newspaper, which is a newspaper from the inauguration 1789, it says that he leaned over and kissed the Bible, showing his respect and reverence for God's Word. He then began his address to the people below, his inaugural address, the first inaugural address in American history, and he started with offering a prayer himself. And then he asked the people to pray. And once he finished his inaugural address, the next thing they did, the House and the Senate and the President, they had a parade. But not like we have today, because they had a parade that led to church. They all went to church together, and when they got into church, the chaplain of the Senate, the Reverend Samuel Provost, he preached a sermon, he taught from the Bible, they had Bible lessons, they had prayer, and they had worship. And then after they finished that church service, they all marched back to Federal Hall where they go into Congress and they closed the inauguration. And that inauguration was filled with religious activities. And this is how our nation began.
My name is Elijah ONeill. I am 20 years old. I'm from Phoenix, Arizona. They should come to this program if they love truth, if they love the idea of upholding principles and the principles that made this nation great. The scripture in Proverbs that talks about he who walks with the wise will become wise, but the companion of fools suffers much harm. And I think about Tim Barton and David Barton on how these men are super wise, and for 2 weeks I've had the chance to walk with them as they show me history using primary source documents. And not only do they have an abundance in knowledge, but they have an abundance in wisdom because they've understood how to apply that knowledge. And being able to come here and learn from them has just been an incredible experience. It's something I'm going to take with me the rest of my life, and it's just made me more valiant and braver to stand up for what I know is right because I know truth. I would tell people to come because truth is worth it. Truth is something that is not easily found in this generation, and it's here. And so if you are a believer in Christ, if you want your faith reaffirmed or strengthened, come here because it will teach you how to be a warrior for Christ.